At this point, I'll turn it over to Nick Gawrit to focus on the next topic. Nick.
Hey, thank you, Chris. All right, Paul, we can get into it. So let's do the next slide. And let's talk about the cardiac procedure note. And basically, just as a primer so everybody understands what we're talking about, is the cardiac procedure note started out as the cath report content profile. Then we added the EPR-CIE for implants and explants last 2 years ago, and embarked on a new methodology of trying to create one standardized content profile that we could use for any cardiology report. So it's a very big step from being isolated individual content profiles to developing a standardized way of doing cardiac reporting, which we hope can actually be used in other medical reporting besides this. And currently, in the cardiac procedure note, we have support for the implant explants for EP and the whole cath PCI structured heart interventional reporting area. And with the future expansion being, we're going to include what we used to have in the CIRC profile, that hopefully we'll be doing that in the next year or two to include that in this particular standardized structure and content that we have. So it was a very big process to switch from the idea of having one specific report content profile for one particular type of report into coming up with a standardized approach to all of them. So that's what a really big benefit of this whole cardiac procedure note is. So once we have this standardized way of looking at things, it makes it very easy for implementers and developers to use this type of process. Next slide, Paul. So why would you want to implement the CPN? And what impact does it have on workflows? Well, just on the technical aspect of it, we have this whole concept of content creator and content consumer. A content creator, in layman's terms, is the lab, the CVIS, the reporting system you're particularly using. The content consumer can be the EHR, can be a cardiac registry like American College of Cardiology, ACC. It could be a government registry for maybe UDI reporting, or it could even be physician type of offices. So the consumers are those type of people and the creator are the others. And this content profile addresses a standardized way of looking at how we write a procedure note, both in the nomenclature and the standards we use. So when we look at the workflow process of everything Chris was mentioning and Jerry was previously mentioning, this fits right in that whole structured approach to looking at things, how we can move data from one place to the other with avoiding data duplication, as Jerry was talking about, and keeping it in a consistent manner that can be used both at the data level, not just a PDF any longer. So that's why we want to have a consistent CPN, cardiac procedure note, that can be used in any of the workflow processes. Next slide, please. And as we talked about the standards drive everything we're doing. So these are some of them. Of course, we have things Chris had mentioned already. We have additional things that we looked at in this, RX norm, for example, the ICD registry from ACC, the TVT registry, etc., CAP PCI registry, including the different versions. And it creates challenges for us because when we're looking at data and we want to have data moving from A to B, the standards of how we move data from A to B change, right? So we have to have a content profile that can be adaptable. So we've adopted extensible value sets to accommodate data that may change from point A to point B and different versioning of those kind of documents. So getting involved in the standards is really super important to making a very good step in getting a solid workflow process. And when we do these types of events on content profiles, we really have to concentrate on all these different industry standards. We can't just cavalierly just assign whatever we want to. So we're very, very concerned and very specific of how we try to define our information flowing from A to B. So the next slide. So now let's talk about CDA. So we elected to use CDA, Clinical Document Architecture, to create our document sources, and then we use a concept called CCDA, Consolidated Clinical Document Architecture, both from HL7, which is a more U.S. realm-specific thing, to design the actual procedure note. So we're looking at a methodology of taking information to go to A to B. So we've selected an HL7 standard to do that type of thing. And with that standard, we're allowed to move not just the data, but also image information, those kind of things, or reference image information within your network. You can either package it or you can reference it. And things appear in a very orderly manner, things called headers, sections, and entries. And to put some context around what is that in a more of a user-looking term, a header really contains basic information. What kind of procedure was done, who did it, what hospital was it performed at, that kind of information, the birth date of the patient's name. Sections, and we're going to see a slide on sections a little bit, and I'll go in more detail. And there's just ways of organizing how different parts of a procedure note might look. So we might want to have a medical history section, or a pre-procedure indication section, a results findings section at the end, recommendations. Those kind of things are what sections are. And entries really describe types of things that occur within a section. So an observation or results or a particular lab results or lab finding, those things fit in there. And as I'd mentioned previously, the whole concept of value sets is to take information in an extensible format so vendors can expand upon it to meet user needs and not be stuck with a particular set, and allow us to have that flexibility to have information flow from A to B with some sort of standardization. And you will see, we're not going to probably dive into value sets at all because it gets very technical, but those concepts Chris mentioned earlier of SNOMED CT, LOINC, IEEE 11073 for medical devices, RX norm, those are the kind of institutional nomenclature we're using to move data from A to B. And contextually, when we're looking at a section, I'm going to say something more technical, it's template ID. So it's a number assigned to the section, basically. That gives it some meaning. So you can say, I know that I'm in medical history, and I'm in maybe family history or family history, and within that, I know I have a history of coronary artery disease, that kind of thing. So that's what we're doing with this whole CDA structure in our particular documentation. So the next slide, please. And here are our sections, and I'm not going to read them all, but if you look at them, they really kind of make a lot of sense. They mean a lot to anybody working in cardiology for sure, and there's a lot of application of this in any kind of procedure note, really. So these kinds of information are what we are tracking in a procedure note environment. So we break them up into these major sections, and when we get further on, we're going to see an example of an implant-explant report, and we can render information by sections, which means we can say, here is the section, and here is all the data that's within the section, and you can actually see it in a manner that looks very English-like, even though the underlying XML is very, very complex and hard to read. But when you're actually, as a user side, looking at these sections, looking at the entries within them, makes it very, very user-friendly and easy to look at. So when we structured our CAF report content and our EPR-CIE report content profiles, we ended up deviating in areas mainly by value sets. So when we put this whole project together, it was a little more effort than we thought it was going to be, but we've come up with a standardized way of doing our sections for our procedure notes. And we can cover everything for CAF PCI, structured heart reporting, TAVR, et cetera, and EPR-CIE, all in the same procedure note. So from a vendor perspective, it makes it tremendously easier to adopt profiles. You're not having to comply with multiple ones. We're going to have very specific, here is the whole generic procedure note profile. So these are our sections. So next slide. And the little thing you see on the left, which I don't expect you to read, that Paul just clicked, is the XML that underlines the CCDA document we've developed. That's that stuff. It's not really easy to read, and it's very clunky. However, when you go to the next slide, I don't think you can blow it up. Yeah. this is where we start rendering the information. And within there, this is the header rendered at the top, and the bottom there's a table of contents for each section. We talked about sections before. We can click on a section and see all the different information on the section. And then we also click the next one, Paul, can see a rendered document that could be a PDF that's attached to the information. An important thing to remember, the whole thing with procedure noting is when we're doing this type of application, there can be textual components, you know, someone's typed in manual findings or something like that. But really what we're trying to achieve is to have discrete data elements that are packaged behind the scenes that can be consumed by the EHR, or whoever else needs to consume it, but also be able to be viewed without having to see the ugly XML behind it, because that really is kind of ugly. But we can see that in an EHR, if they just rendered the document, they can see most of the things there, including a packaged PDF of a much more narrative-looking report, which for Good Health EP Clinic. Next one. That's just a continuation of the sections on the rendering. So if we're scrolling down, we see a rendered report, and then we can see each section, and within the sections, we can see the information that was put down in each section. That's what those entries we were talking about before. And this is what the procedure note looks like. Goal in this particular example, everything is driven by data points. There is no real data entry unless somebody's put some manual noting in that they want to have as a textual component. And so the whole concept of PCDA is to have sections, the text be reflective of all the information that is in the entries. Okay, Paul, next slide. And how was this all accomplished? So this is the very techie slide that maybe people will get. You can turn it off if you don't want to listen to it. But anyway, we had a very long effort of whether we should continue to making things in a Word documentation format or use an industry standard tool. And after much analysis, we modeled our things with a major effort from Chris Melo in Artdecor. And Artdecor is a tool that IHE is adopting in many different respects, and I think ours is the first real full-on profile like this that's used Artdecor in this manner, where we can define our sections and entries using tools without having to go through manually typing things in Word or cutting and pasting. And so the consistency of our documentation is tremendous. So for developers and implementers of this, the documentation work in Artdecor is super, super important. AR value sets are published in there, all of our sections entries, our header relationships, and whatever we make, we actually have a version control on them as well. So if we, in the future, we can actually have version control for this particular documentation. Was I muted? I don't think so. But anyway, why does it say speaking? Can you guys hear me?
Yep, we can hear you, Nick.
Hello?
Yes,
okay.
Yes, we can hear you.
Anyway, so Artdecor was a huge tooling effort. I probably can't even describe how much effort went into doing Artdecor and testing Artdecor to make it work for doing these types of things. But it certainly makes the basis for the future for us releasing content profiles for the rest of the cardiology domain and for other domains that want to follow procedure noting and these kind of things. Because you can add sections, you can add entries, and you can add value set items and use add new value sets if you so desire. And that's the beauty of having it in a tool like this. So I would really like to just mention how much effort went into Artdecor, especially with Chris and a bunch of other people working on the different standards for the XML documents, like Rebecca and Dan and Charles and whoever else worked there. There's tons of people working on all this stuff. But it was a big effort to get that information in there and get it done. But now that it's in there, it makes it super, super easy to use. And next slide. So again, summarizing the benefits of this whole thing, by having things in a standardized procedure note format, it really does help the whole workflow process. And if you see in the second bullet, diabetes means diabetes. We know based on a template ID and a SNOMED CT code that this is diabetes that's part of medical history. In the past, you could have diabetes somewhere up here that you're doing big data mining, but you lose the context a lot of times of where that diabetes is. It happened after the procedure, something that's family related. So having this whole standardized look for CPN makes it really easy to do. And the whole, I can't even underline this ability to consume the discrete data. So an EHR can consume the document. A registry could consume the document. Conceivably, in the future, I see procedure notes being consumed directly by the registries with supplemental information following, up to discharge. But taking the onus of, again, avoiding manual duplication of data, taking it directly from sources when they're occurring, and not having this whole idea of repeating data entry over and over again. Again, this whole concept of using standards makes all this possible. And the other really cool thing is when we look at reports, and they kind of look and feel the same. There's also one other big benefit that is kind of unknown on this slide, but when we have a particular system like this with CPN, and we are using standardized nomenclature, that doesn't preclude us from having different languages in the nomenclature. So we could define this report and have a separate language lookup for other people wanting to do it in a different language. So the same report could be distributed internationally without having to really change anything, just changing the specific of how the person reads the label. That's very simple. So great benefit of using this kind of standard. We kind of get rid of transcription. We get rid of the whole concept of the physician signing off. They can actually see reports when they're occurring. And ultimately, the data we're using, the discrete data we're using, agrees with the report we're using, so we don't have to worry about that. And I think that might be the end of my presentation.